We took one Mustang GT, the same 5.0 Coyote engine, and ran it on 5W-20 for 6 months, then drained everything and switched to 5W-30 for the next 6 months. Same driver, same routes, same oil change intervals, same used oil analysis lab. I wanted a real answer to a question I get asked constantly in the shop. Does the thicker oil actually protect this engine better, or is it just internet noise? What we found in the oil analysis surprised even me, and it's going to change what I recommend to Coyote owners going forward. Let's get into it. I need to start with some history, because the 5W-20 versus 5W-30 debate on the Coyote engine isn't random internet arguing. Ford actually changed its own recommendation. The Gen 1 Coyote in the 2011 through 2014 Mustang GT and the Gen 2 Coyote in the 2015 through 2017 cars both left the factory speccing 5W-20. Then Ford redesigned the engine for 2018, the Gen 3 Coyote, and quietly moved the factory fill up to 5W-30. Same basic architecture, same displacement, same bore spacing, but a full viscosity grade heavier at operating temperature. Ford doesn't make a change like that for fun. Engineering changes to lubrication specs cost money in warranty documentation, dealer retraining, and owner's manual reprints. When a manufacturer does it anyway, it's because they found a problem the lighter oil wasn't fully solving. The car I used for this test is a 2017 Mustang GT, a Gen 2 Coyote, 5.0 liters, naturally aspirated, factory rated at 435 horsepower. I picked this specific model year on purpose. It's the last year Ford still called for 5W-20 on this platform, which means I could legally run either viscosity without violating a factory spec that voids anything, and it gave me a clean before and after on the exact same hardware. The car came into my shop with 41,000 miles on it, owned by a customer named Dale, who autocrosses it twice a month and daily drives it the rest of the time. Dale agreed to let me use his car for the full year in exchange for free oil changes and full disclosure of everything we found. That's the deal I offer anyone who volunteers a car for these long-term tests. Before we started, I pulled a baseline oil sample from whatever was already in the pan, sent it to the lab, and got a reference point for wear metals at 41,000 miles on factory-recommended 5W-20. Iron came back at 14 parts per million, copper at 3 parts per million, aluminum at 4 parts per million, and lead at 2 parts per million. Those numbers are healthy for a Coyote at that mileage. Iron in a Ford V8 typically comes from cylinder wall and timing chain wear, copper from bushings and the oil cooler, aluminum from piston skirts and bearing overlay, and lead from bearing material in older formulations, though it shows up in trace amounts even in modern bearings. This baseline mattered because it told me the engine was in good health going into the test, not compensating for existing wear. I also pulled the full additive package breakdown on that baseline sample because viscosity isn't the only variable that changes between a 5W-20 and a 5W-30 bottle, even within the same product line. Zinc and phosphorus, the elements behind ZDDP, the anti-wear additive that protects cam lobes and flat tappet contact points, came back nearly identical between the two Motorcraft formulations I used, so that variables stayed controlled. The main functional difference between the two oils was the viscosity index improver package, the polymer additives that let a multigrade oil behave like a thinner oil when cold and a thicker oil when hot. A 5W-30 needs a stronger dose of these polymers to widen that spread compared to a 5W-20, and those polymers matter because they're also the first thing to shear down under sustained high heat and high RPM, which is exactly the condition track driving creates. I bring this up because it's part of why I chose to stay within the same brand and product family for both halves of the test. Switching oil brands between phases would have introduced differences in base oil group, in polymer chemistry, and in detergent and dispersant packages, any of which could explain a change in wear numbers that had nothing to do with viscosity at all. For the first 6-month phase, I ran Motorcraft full synthetic 5W-20, changed every 5,000 miles, which lined up with 3 oil changes and 3 used oil analysis samples across that window. Dale drove the car normally roughly 1,100 miles a month between commuting and weekend track days. I logged oil temperature during every track session using a scan tool plugged into the OBD2 port, because oil temperature is really the variable that determines whether 5W-20 or 5W-30 matters at all. On the street in mild weather, oil temperature on this car settled around 210 to 220 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right in the window both viscosities are designed to protect. But on track days, running sustained high RPM with hard braking and sustained lateral load, oil temperature climbed as high as 260 to 270 degrees. That's where things get interesting, because viscosity index and film strength start to separate at those temperatures. Here's the mechanical reason this matters on a Coyote specifically. This engine uses twin independent variable camshaft timing called TIVCT, which relies on oil pressure to actuate the cam phasers. Those phasers have tight tolerances and depend on the oil maintaining adequate film strength at the phaser gear teeth and the internal spool valve. When oil gets too thin at high temperature, you get increased metal-to-metal contact inside the phaser assembly, and over years that shows up as cam phaser rattle on cold start, a well-documented issue on the 3.5 EcoBoost that some Coyote owners worry about too, though the Coyote's port and direct injection combination and its VCT design have historically been more forgiving than the EcoBoost twin turbo setup. Still, thinner oil under sustained high heat is not doing those phasers any favors. The rod and main bearings are the other consideration. The Generation 2 Coyote runs bearing clearances designed around 5W-20 at normal operating temperature, but those clearances open up slightly as metal expands under heat and load. A thinner oil can lose enough film strength at that expanded clearance and elevated temperature that you get partial boundary lubrication instead of full hydrodynamic lubrication, meaning the crank journal and bearing surface are closer to actual contact than the oil film is designed to allow. This doesn't cause instant failure. It causes accelerated wear that shows up gradually in oil analysis long before it shows up as a knock you can hear. There's a third mechanical piece people overlook, and that's the oil pump and the top-end galleys feeding the roller finger followers on the valvetrain. The Coyote uses roller finger followers with a hydraulic lash adjuster at one end, and those adjusters depend on consistent oil pressure and film strength to keep zero lash without collapsing under valve spring load. Under sustained high RPM, valve spring pressure climbs and the demand on that hydraulic adjuster increases right along with it. A thinner oil that's lost some of its film strength at 260 plus degrees can allow slightly more bleed down in that adjuster between cam lobe events, which shows up as a subtle tick or slightly reduced valve control at high RPM long before it becomes an audible problem at idle. I didn't have the equipment to measure valve train acoustics precisely enough to call this conclusively in Dale's car, but it's a documented failure pathway on high mileage, track-driven Coyotes, and it's part of why Ford's own engineering team would have looked at viscosity as one lever among several when they revised the Generation 3 specification. I also want to walk through exactly how I standardized the testing so nobody accuses me of cherry-picking convenient data points. Every sample went to the same independent lab, run on the same spectrographic analysis equipment using the same test package that includes wear metals, contaminants, viscosity at 100 degrees Celsius, and total base number, which tells you how much of the oil's detergent and acid neutralizing capacity is left. Total base number stayed healthy across both phases, never dropping below 60% of new oil TBN at any 5,000-mile interval, which confirms neither oil was being pushed past its useful service life before we drained it. Viscosity at 100 degrees Celsius also came back within spec range for both grades across every sample, meaning neither oil had sheared down into the next grade below its rating, which would have muddied the comparison significantly, especially for the 5W-30 during the highest heat track events. Back to the test. After the 3 5W-20 samples across the first 6 months and roughly 6,600 combined track and street miles, I averaged the wear metal trends. Iron climbed from the 14 parts per million baseline to an average of 19 parts per million across the 3 samples, with the highest reading of 22 parts per million coming after the most aggressive track weekend, a 2-day autocross event where the car saw sustained oil temperatures above 265 degrees for extended periods. Copper held fairly steady around 4 to 5 parts per million. Aluminum ticked up slightly to 5 to 6 parts per million. None of these numbers are alarming in isolation. A healthy Coyote can run in this range for a long time without issue, but the trend line was clearly climbing, and it climbed fastest during and right after the highest oil temperature events. At the 6-month mark, I did a full flush, changed the oil filter, and switched to Motorcraft full synthetic 5W-30, the same brand and formulation family, just the heavier grade, to keep the comparison as clean as possible and remove the variable of different oil brands using different additive packages. If I'd switched to a different manufacturer's oil at the same time, I wouldn't know whether any change in wear numbers came from the viscosity or from a different additive chemistry. Same base oil technology, same brand, one variable changed. The second 6 months looked almost identical in terms of driving pattern. Dale kept up the same commute, the same monthly mileage, and critically, the same track schedule, including another 2-day autocross weekend that let me compare apples to apples against the roughest event from the first half of the test. I changed oil at the same 5,000-mile interval and sent 3 more samples to the same lab using the same test method, so there's no lab-to-lab variance skewing the numbers either. If you're finding this test useful, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we've got a whole series of these long-term comparisons running on other platforms, and you don't want to miss the results when we do this same test on a Coyote swap truck later this year. The results from the 5W-30 phase were clear. Iron across the 3 samples averaged 13 parts per million, actually slightly below the original baseline. Copper stayed at 3 to 4 parts per million. Aluminum came in at 3 to 4 parts per million. And the highest single reading, taken right after the comparable 2-day autocross weekend, was 15 parts per million of iron, compared to 22 parts per million after the equivalent event on 5W-20. That's a meaningful gap, and it lines up exactly with what the mechanical theory predicts. The heavier oil maintained better film strength during the highest heat, highest load driving, which is precisely when the Coyote's bearings and cam phasers are most vulnerable to thin film wear. I also tracked oil consumption across both phases, because that's another practical concern owners bring up. On 5W-20, the car used about half a quart across each 5,000-mile interval, which is normal for a Coyote with 40,000 plus miles on it. On 5W-30, oil consumption dropped slightly, using closer to a quarter quart per interval. Thicker oil generally does a better job resisting blow-by past the rings at operating temperature, especially as ring lands and cylinder walls accumulate normal wear over time, so this result also tracked with expectations. Cold start behavior is where 5W-20 has its real advantage, and I want to be fair about that, because this is a genuine trade-off, not a one-sided win for the heavier oil. On a cold morning, Dale commutes at 6 a.m. most days. Oil pressure builds noticeably faster on 5W-20 because the thinner oil flows through the pump and up to the top end quicker before the engine reaches operating temperature. Using the Scan Tools oil pressure PID, I logged that 5W-20 reached stable oil pressure at idle about 1.5 to 2 seconds faster than 5W-30 on cold mornings in the 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit range we had through part of this test. That's a real number, and in the handful of seconds right after a cold start before oil has fully circulated is genuinely one of the higher wear moments in any engine's life. If Dale lives somewhere with regular sub-freezing mornings, this would weigh more heavily in my final recommendation, because 5W-30 can get noticeably thicker and slower to circulate in true cold climates. Fuel economy is the other side most people ask about. Across the 5W-20 phase, Dale's car averaged 21.4 miles per gallon in his mixed commuting and highway driving, based on fuel receipts and trip logs he kept for me. Across the 5W-30 phase, average fuel economy came in at 20.9 miles per gallon, a drop of about half a mile per gallon, That's consistent with the general rule that thinner oils reduce internal friction slightly and return marginally better fuel economy, which is exactly why manufacturers have been chasing lighter viscosities for the last 2 decades to hit corporate average fuel economy targets. It's a real difference, but on a V8 muscle car that most owners aren't buying for economy in the first place, half a mile per gallon is not the number that should decide this argument. I also want to talk about what Ford itself did with the Gen 3 Coyote, because it's the strongest piece of evidence in this whole discussion. When Ford redesigned the 5.0 for 2018, they kept the same basic architecture, same displacement, same general bearing design philosophy, but moved the factory oil spec to 5W-30. Ford's engineers had years of real-world data and warranty claims from Gen 1 and Gen 2 Coyote engines to work from, including from cars used in exactly the way Dale uses his, mixed daily driving with track use. A manufacturer doesn't move a spec heavier unless the data supports it, because heavier oil generally costs them slightly in fuel economy testing, which matters for their compliance numbers. The fact that Ford accepted that trade-off tells you they found real benefit on the protection side that outweighed the economy penalty, particularly for engines that see hard use. So where does that leave the verdict for Dale's 2017 and for any Gen 1 or Gen 2 Coyote owner wondering what to run? For a car that spends real time at sustained high RPM and high oil temperature, whether that's track days, autocross, spirited canyon driving, or towing a race trailer around, the data from this test points clearly toward 5W-30. The wear metal numbers were lower across the board during the heavier oil phase, the gap widened specifically during the highest heat events, and oil consumption improved too. For a car that's purely a mild-mannered daily driver, never sees track duty, and lives somewhere with genuinely cold winters, the case for sticking with factory 5W-20 is more reasonable, because the cold start advantage and the fuel economy edge matter more when the engine never experiences the sustained high oil temperatures where 5W-30 pulled ahead in this test. Dale's decision, for what it's worth, was easy once he saw the numbers. He's kept the car on 5W-30 permanently since we wrapped this test, and I've since made the same recommendation to 4 other customers running Gen 1 and Gen 2 Coyote Mustangs who track their cars regularly. None of them have run into any issues with oil pressure or cold start behavior switching over, even in a Midwest winter, though I always tell people to check their specific climate before making that call. If you're seeing negative temperatures regularly, talk to a shop familiar with your specific car before committing to the heavier grade year-round. I also went back and looked at what other independent data exists on this exact question, because a single customer car, even with careful controls, is still a sample size of 1 engine. Enthusiast forums dedicated to 5th and 6th generation Mustangs have compiled hundreds of owner-submitted oil analysis reports over the years, mostly through Blackstone Labs, and the pattern in that larger dataset lines up with what I found on Dale's car. Gen 1 and Gen 2 Coyote owners running 5W-30 in cars that see regular track use consistently report lower iron and aluminum trends than owners running factory 5W-20 under comparable mileage and driving conditions. It's not a controlled study, and there's plenty of noise and crowdsourced data like that. Driving style, oil change intervals, and reporting bias all play a role. But it's a large enough sample that it stopped being a coincidence to me a long time ago, and it's a big part of why I was confident recommending this test to Dale in the first place, instead of just going off theory and a handful of forum posts. There's also a practical warranty consideration worth mentioning for anyone thinking about making this switch on their own car. Ford's powertrain warranty language doesn't lock you into the exact factory viscosity for the life of the engine. It requires an oil meeting the correct API service category and Ford's WSS specification, and Motorcraft's 5W-30 full synthetic meets those same base requirements as the 5W-20 version, just at a different viscosity grade. Running a properly certified 5W-30 in a Gen 1 or Gen 2 Coyote isn't the kind of deviation that gives a dealership grounds to deny a warranty claim, the way running the wrong API category or skipping oil changes entirely would be. If your car is still under factory powertrain coverage and you're nervous about this, keep your receipts and stick with a full synthetic that carries the correct Ford WSSM 2C946B or later certification printed on the bottle, and you're covered either way. The bigger picture here is that oil viscosity isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, even within the same engine family. It's a trade-off between cold flow and hot film strength. And where that trade-off lands best depends entirely on how the car actually gets driven. A Coyote that never sees a track and lives somewhere cold has a legitimate case for staying on the lighter factory spec. A Coyote that regularly sees sustained high RPM, high load, and high oil temperature the way Dale's does showed measurably better protection numbers on the heavier oil across every category I tracked. That's not a marketing opinion. That's what came back from the lab 3 times in a row on each side of this test. One more thing worth mentioning, because I know the comments are going to ask, this test used one car across 2 time periods rather than 2 identical cars run simultaneously, which means seasonal variation, road conditions, and normal mileage accumulation are variables I can't fully separate from the viscosity change. I tried to control for as much as I could by matching mileage, driving pattern, and even matching a comparable track event in each phase, but I want to be upfront that this isn't a laboratory-controlled dyno test. It's a real-world, real customer car test, which has its own value because it reflects how these engines actually get used, but it's not the same as an SAE-certified bearing wear study. Take the numbers as strong directional evidence, not absolute scientific proof. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're running the same viscosity comparison next on a 2019 Coyote-swapped F-150, this time testing 5W-30 against 0W-40 for guys running these engines in trucks that see towing duty, and those results are going to surprise people just as much as this one did. Drop a comment and let me know which viscosity you're running in your Coyote and whether you've ever pulled an oil analysis on it yourself. I'll see you in the next one.